Part 1. There are towns where life seems to drift along with a kind of quiet predictability, where days repeat themselves gently, without interruption or alarm. Greenhithe, in the early 1990s, was one of those places. It had its rhythms, its patterns, its familiar faces that crossed paths in the small parades of shops or along the same suburban pavements lined with hedges and low fences. Children walked to school in groups or alone without much fear, and teenagers made their way to friends' houses on foot, unbothered by the winter evenings that settled early across Kent. This normality, this easy confidence in the everyday, was the air the town breathed, until the day it wasn't. In January of 1993, the weather had been what people in Kent described as dreary, yet typical, damp, gray, a cold that settled into clothing like a second skin. That Monday, the 18th of January, 16-year-old Clare Tiltman stepped out of her home on Woodward Terrace with the casual certainty of someone who had done the walk many times before. She was heading to her friend Vicky's house to talk about school, exams, and the scaffolding of plans that teenagers build for the future. Only 4 days had passed since Clare's 16th birthday, and life had felt like it was just beginning to unfurl in front of her. Clare was the only child of Cliff and Linda Tiltman, parents whose love for her was visible in every photograph and every memory that friends later shared. She was bright, spirited, with the easy smile of someone comfortable in the world, and with the kind of warmth that drew others in. Her teachers admired her. Her friends adored her. She had joined the local fire station as part of her Duke of Edinburgh award work, a commitment that revealed what many already knew, that Clare was brave, community-minded, and quietly determined. That evening, as she left the house wearing her school jacket zipped to her neck, she did what she had done countless times before. She chose to walk. Vicky's mother had offered her a lift, but Clare liked the independence, liked the fresh air, and liked the simple freedom of moving under her own power toward the life she imagined. She stopped at a small off-license along the way. The street lamps glowed pale gold against the damp air. Traffic hummed along London Road with its usual weekday rhythm. Clare headed toward the Arches, a local name for the railway bridge underpass, and prepared to turn into the narrow alley that would save her several minutes. She could not have known that in that small, dim stretch of pathway, someone was waiting. Investigators would later conclude Clare was attacked from behind, a large knife, a sudden strike, no time to react, no chance to defend herself. The attack was frenzied, violent, and deliberate. Each wound inflicted with speed and force, the kind of brutality that spoke not of panic or theft, but of a predator striking with purpose. In the aftermath, Clare did something that would be remembered by everyone who came to know her story. She fought to live. She pushed herself out of the alley, staggering toward the road, toward the lights, toward someone who might help her. Around 6:40 that evening, a man named Michael Godfrey was driving with a colleague along London Road. As his vehicle approached the alley's entrance, he saw something that made him slow the car, a shape on the pavement, a girl on her hands and knees. At first, the scene looked like a hit and run, the kind of misfortune that occasionally haunts even quiet towns. But when he reached Clare's side, he saw the truth. The blood, the wounds, the desperate fight for breath. Michael did what he could. His colleague ran to call emergency services from a nearby pub. Michael stayed, speaking softly to Clare, checking her breathing, trying to keep her conscious as the life she fought so hard to hold on to slipped beyond reach. Paramedics arrived and did everything their training and experience allowed, but the injuries were too severe. Clare was pronounced dead at the scene, the cold pavement beneath her, the street lamps shining down on the moment her story ended, and another story, the one that would haunt a region for decades, began. News traveled quickly in Greenhithe. A 16-year-old girl murdered on a short walk to see a friend? It was unthinkable. Schools reacted with shock. Teenagers who had walked those streets all their lives now looked over their shoulders. Parents gathered their children close. The Tiltman family's world collapsed in a way that words fail to encompass. Cliff and Linda had lost their daughter, their only child, the center of their lives. The next morning at Clare's school, Dartford Grammar School for Girls, confusion rippled before confirmation settled. Early radio bulletins mentioned a teenage girl killed nearby. Students whispered, anxious, trying to make sense of fragments. When the head teacher entered the room and turned off the radio, hearts dropped. A police liaison officer and the head of year gathered the girls, Clare's friends, classmates, all those who had laughed with her only days before, and told them the truth. Gasps, tears, disbelief. Clare, who had celebrated her birthday days earlier, who had gone out that evening planning to discuss her future, was gone. Kent police launched a major incident investigation immediately. Operation Artist. Officers descended on the alley and surrounding roads. They combed for evidence, fibers, footprints, the murder weapon, any trace left behind. But the crime scene offered little. No knife. No obvious forensic link to the killer. DNA technology in 1993 was far more limited than the tools available today. Without an item dropped or left behind, without a witness who had seen the attack unfold, progress was slow and uncertain. Detectives canvassed the area, door to door. They spoke to more than 1,500 people. Residents, shopkeepers, commuters. They gathered thousands of details, most of them small, many of them overlapping, a few of them potentially meaningful. Several reported seeing a man wearing a light-colored jacket near the area around the time of the murder. Some described him as hurried, perhaps unsettled. But no one could provide a clear face, a name, or anything definite enough to lead to an arrest. As investigators continued their work, the community entered a state of shared fear. A knife-wielding killer walking free in a small town leaves an imprint deeper than a headline. Mothers who once let their children wander to the corner shop now insisted on accompanying them. Teenagers arranged to walk in groups or avoided evening trips altogether. Silence settled over the pub conversations that once revolved around football scores and gossip. Now, people discussed danger, suspects, and strange behavior. Inside the Tiltman household, grief unfolded with an intensity no parent should ever endure. Clare had been their compass, their pride, their joy. The police urged the public to come forward with any scrap of information. "Someone knows something," they said more than once. And deep down, many believed that to be true. But the case that had begun, with urgency and determination, soon revealed its darker, more complex shape. Because this was not the first time a woman had been violently attacked in that corner of Kent. Nor would it be the last. Detectives unearthed the file of an assault from December 1988, not far from Greenhithe, where a 27-year-old woman had been abducted at gunpoint, taken to a quarry, violated, humiliated, and stabbed repeatedly, and somehow survived. That case had gone cold. No arrest, no closure. And then, 2 years after Clare's murder, in October 1995, another young woman would be stabbed, this time near the very same arches, only yards from where Clare had died. The similarities were impossible to ignore. A knife, a random female victim. A sudden, frenzied attack. No robbery, no sexual assault, in Clare's case just pure, directed violence. Detectives now began to consider not one crime, but a series. A pattern, a predator, someone living among them. Someone who was still out there. And someone who had struck before. Someone who would strike again. The investigation grew darker because the truth, when it finally surfaced, would reveal not a moment of madness or an isolated incident, but the path of a man who had stalked the streets of Kent with a private hunger for violence. A man who knew Clare. A man who attended her birthday days before her murder. A man who stood among mourners at her funeral. A man who called the police pretending to be a witness. A man who wrote diaries describing his attacks as masterpieces. A man who carried knives nightly, waiting for opportunity. A man who, for decades, slipped through the cracks of an investigation dedicated to catching him. This is the story of how that man was finally unmasked, and how justice, though late and painfully earned, prevailed. The days following Clare Tiltman's murder became a tangle of grief, fear, and speculation. Greenhithe was the kind of place where people prided themselves on knowing their neighbors, where someone unusual walking down the street drew curiosity long before suspicion. But after Clare died, that instinct changed. Now, an unfamiliar face meant danger. A hurried movement meant threat. A late-night noise meant dread. And beneath this quiet panic, Kent police worked relentlessly to reconstruct the final steps of a girl who should have lived a long life. In the center of the investigation stood an alleyway barely wide enough for two people to pass. A path that generations of locals had used as a harmless shortcut. Officers walked its length repeatedly, stopping at any irregularity, a scuff mark, a broken twig, a stain, a disturbed patch of dirt. They brought in specialist dogs, forensic teams, crime scene photographers, and still, the alley yielded little. Rain had washed away the trace evidence that might have clung to its ground. No murder weapon surfaced. No hair, no fiber. Nothing that gave them a forensic handhold strong enough to pull them toward a suspect. One of the earliest difficulties investigators faced was the speed of the attack. It had been fast, a flurry of motion in the dark. Whoever had done it had not lingered. Whoever had done it had not spoken. And whoever had done it did not leave behind anything that could be definitively tied to them. What detectives did have was a town full of memories, unreliable, scattered, but sometimes sharp enough to matter. People told police about a man in a light-colored jacket. Some thought he walked briskly near the arches that evening. Others believed they saw him standing near a zebra crossing, seemingly restless, but their recollections clashed in time and angle, as memories often do. And without a face, without a name, the police could only file each detail like a puzzling piece of a picture they did not yet know how to assemble. The investigation pressed on, and suspicion fell, briefly, on a local man named Peter Rivers. In February of 1994, about a year after Clare's death, Rivers murdered his mother in a brutal domestic attack and then took his own life. In a note he left behind, he wrote that his mother had begun suspecting him of Clare's murder. It was a chilling detail, one that detectives could not afford to ignore. They re-examined his background, examined his movements around Clare's murder, and looked at the details of his later crime. Nothing aligned cleanly. Rivers' violence was inward, confined to his family home, with no pattern of stalking or attacking strangers. And in the end, police ruled him out as Clare's killer. As they moved on from that lead, detectives' attention was drawn, again and again, to the quarry attack of December 1988, 5 years before Clare died. That earlier case had begun with a woman walking home from a late shift in Swanscombe, a short distance from Greenhithe. It was the sort of routine journey that thousands of people took nightly, unthinking, unconcerned. But that night, a man stepped from the darkness, brandishing a gun and a knife. He forced the woman to walk with him through the cold, into the abandoned chalk quarry. And there, beneath the silent stone walls, he subjected her to a torment so deliberate it seemed ritualistic. He gagged her with toilet paper, cut her clothes away, threatened her with the knife, took photographs of her, as if documenting the degradation he inflicted. He tried to strangle her with a school tie. The tie snapped. Enraged, he stabbed her repeatedly, in the back, the side, the shoulder blows designed not just to harm, but to end a life. Believing she was dead, he covered her with dirt and debris and vanished into the winter night. Yet she lived. Hours later, freezing, bleeding, barely conscious, she crawled from the quarry pit and was found by workers arriving for their morning shift. She survived, but the horror lived on in her memory and in the files of Kent police, unsolved. The similarities between that crime and Clare's murder were impossible to ignore. A knife, a sudden attack, a location chosen for its isolation, no robbery, no personal motive. Just violence pure, unprovoked, savage. But the quarry case had one thing Clare's murder did not: a survivor. Even though she had barely glimpsed her attacker, she provided one detail she felt certain about: the man had dark, curly hair. That detail would echo years later in ways no investigator could yet imagine. In the meantime, the police continued their exhaustive work. There were hundreds of people to interview, thousands of pages to review, and a community still grappling with the bruised sense of safety that Clare's death had stripped away. But there was another thread woven quietly into the chaos: a telephone call. The day after Clare died, a man phoned police. He claimed he had been driving in the area around the time of the murder and had seen a suspicious figure near a zebra crossing, someone with curly dark hair, behaving in a way that caught his attention. To the officers listening, the detail felt promising. Curly dark hair just like the quarry attacker, a man near the murder scene. But when detectives met with the caller a week later, the story changed. Now he said he had been out earlier that evening around 5:45 to 5:55 and had seen someone entirely different. And instead of simply driving through the area, he now claimed he had been delivering political leaflets with his mother, and that the two had returned home by 6 o'clock. The investigators wrote down both statements, puzzled. Why was the timing different? Why had the details shifted so dramatically? The explanation the caller gave, that he had simply remembered things more clearly later, was noted. But something about the inconsistency stuck with detectives. They flagged the statement in the case file. Something didn't feel right. But with no evidence tying the caller to the murder, and no reason to suspect he was anything other than a confused witness, the police moved on. As weeks stretched into months, Claire's parents fought through their grief to attend every press appeal, every vigil, every moment where public awareness might bring information forward. Their hope was fragile but persistent. They clung to the belief that someone, a partner, a friend, a neighbor, might have seen something strange on the night Clare died. Maybe someone came home with blood on their clothes. Maybe someone disposed of an item in secret. Maybe a normally calm man became withdrawn or frantic. But no breakthrough came. 3 weeks after Clare's murder, her funeral took place. It was attended by hundreds, friends, classmates, teachers, neighbors, community members, and, quietly, by detectives who understood that sometimes the most dangerous people slip into crowds unnoticed. They kept an eye on the congregation, scanning for anyone who looked out of place, anyone overly emotional or strangely calm, anyone with a distinctive jacket or mannerism. Clare's mother, Linda, would later say she felt, instinctively, that the killer was there. She couldn't explain why, she simply felt the presence of a wrongness in the room. A sense that the person who had taken her daughter was within reach, yet untouchable. "You look around," she said, "and you hope it's someone you don't know. But you can't help thinking it might be someone standing right there." Her instinct, years later, would prove terrifyingly accurate. In the months that followed, police tried everything they could to spark new leads. Crime Watch UK aired a reconstruction of Clare's final movements, using real fire and ambulance personnel who had responded that night. Viewers called in, some offering ideas, some recalling details they thought might help, some suggesting people they thought police should look at. But nothing tangible emerged. Clare's case grew cold, not abandoned, not forgotten, but suspended in a kind of investigative stasis. It remained open, active, and agonizingly unsolved. Then, on the night of the 17th of October 1995, a scream tore through the darkness near the Arches, the same area where Clare had died. A young woman named Charlotte Barnard was walking alone when a man lunged at her, dragging her into the shadows of a derelict industrial site. He stabbed her again and again, around 14 times, with a frenzy that mirrored Clare's murder. But Charlotte survived. Her scream had been heard. A witness saw a figure running. Another saw a car speeding away, a white Ford Capri. The police reacted instantly. They had seen enough patterns to know what they might be dealing with: a serial attacker. And they already knew one man with a white Ford Capri. His name was Colin Ash Smith. Colin was not a stranger. His parents were local councillors. His family frequently attended the British Legion Club, the same club where Clare had celebrated her 16th birthday, only days before she was killed. Colin had been there that night, among the crowd wishing Clare well. He was known, too, for his strange fascination with knives. Friends and acquaintances described him as someone who always had one with him, who collected them obsessively, who treated weapons not as tools but as extensions of some private fantasy. He had a crossbow, air rifles, replica firearms, and knives of various sizes. People who knew him later said that Colin's affinity for blades had made them uneasy long before anyone suspected him of anything. Kent police interviewed him multiple times in 1993 and 1994 as part of the Clare investigation. He denied involvement. He provided an alibi. He was with his mother, Diane Ash Smith, delivering Labour Party leaflets, and returned home before the murder. His mother confirmed it. Without evidence contradicting them, the police had no grounds to take further action. But now, in 1995, a witness had seen a white Ford Capri fleeing the scene of another savage stabbing mere yards from where Clare had been killed. Detectives did not hesitate. They arrested Colin Ash Smith. They searched his home, number 14, Myrtle Place. And what they found changed the course of the investigation forever. In Colin's bedroom, hidden among his belongings, lay a large knife, the very knife used to stab Charlotte Barnard. There were notebooks, diaries, filled with horrifying monologues, detailed descriptions of violent fantasies, accounts of attacks, admissions of crimes. He had written about the 1988 quarry assault. He had written about wanting to feel power over women. He had written about stalking women at train stations, about planning abductions, about rating his success. He had even written that after the quarry attack, he had phoned the police to threaten that, if the victim identified him, he would kill a schoolgirl. Taken alone, the threat might have been dismissed as depraved rambling. But in 1993, a schoolgirl had been murdered in Greenhithe. And now, 2 years later, another young woman had been stabbed in the same place. The diaries spoke louder than any witness. Colin confessed to the 1988 and 1995 attacks. He did not confess to Clare's murder. But for Kent police, everything was beginning to align. The pattern, the proximity, the diaries, the white Ford Capri, the knives, the behavior, the violence, the lies, the alibi, the phone call, and the eerie detail that would emerge later. Colin Ash Smith had attended Clare's funeral wearing a light-colored jacket the same shade witnesses had described the night she died. It was all pointing toward one conclusion. But police still needed enough evidence to prove it in court. And for years, they wouldn't have it. Not until other pieces buried deep in the past, and pieces whispered behind prison walls, finally surfaced. In the aftermath of Colin Ash Smith's arrest for the 1995 stabbing of Charlotte Barnard, the town of Greenhithe found itself caught between shock and grim recognition. People whispered his name in supermarkets, in pubs, at school gates. They talked about the Ash Smith family, well-known, respected, politically active. They talked about the white Ford Capri, about Colin's strange habits, about how he had always seemed a little off. Some remembered seeing him at the British Legion Club. A few recalled that he'd been at Clare Tiltman's 16th birthday gathering. None of them had ever imagined he might be capable of something monstrous. But now, faced with the weapon recovered from his room, and the graphic contents of the diaries seized by police, it seemed impossible to deny the truth. Colin Ash Smith had been a predator, moving quietly through their lives. The discovery of his diaries was nothing short of chilling. Detectives pored over the pages, handwritten accounts of nights wandering the streets, with knives tucked into his clothing, descriptions of stalking women, fantasizing about attacks, and plotting what he called missions. Each entry revealed layers of anger, resentment, and misogyny. He wrote about wanting power, wanting control, wanting to feel something other than the dull, simmering rage that seemed to press on him day after day. He described the 1988 quarry attack in disturbing detail, recounting the gagging, the photographs, the stabbing, and the moment he left the victim for dead. He rated the assault 95% successful, expressing disappointment that he later learned she had survived. In one chilling line, he wrote, "Next time, I will do better." Another entry described how he broke into the home of a woman he had become fixated on, Debbie Jarvis, the wife of a former co-worker. He wrote of slipping into the house when he believed she was alone, only to flee when her husband unexpectedly returned. Debbie and her husband later found pieces of her nightdress cut and wedged onto a door, a silent sign of the threat that had entered their home. They had no idea who had done it. Colin never carried out the attack he fantasized about, but the intent was clear. In the margins of the diary, another line, "Lucky for her, I bottled it." His writings revealed a man who saw women as symbols of humiliation, creatures who, rightly or wrongly in his mind, made him feel small. He described a split within himself, one side desperate for approval, the other seething with resentment, lashing out at any woman he believed had slighted him. He wrote of loneliness, inadequacy, and a deep fear of rejection. But wrapped around these insecurities was something far more dangerous, a violent compulsion he struggled to hide from the world. For police, there was no doubt he was responsible for the 1988 and 1995 attacks. He confessed to both. The question that remained was the one that had haunted Kent police for years. Had he murdered Clare Tiltman? It seemed obvious to investigators, painfully obvious. The geography, the timing, the method, the escalation from 1988 to 1993 to 1995. The random selection of victims, the frenzy of the wounds, the silence of the attack, the lack of motive. All the threads pointed to a single perpetrator. But in 1996, prosecutors did not yet have what they needed to bring him to trial for murder. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no weapon, no confession. And while Colin's diaries screamed violence, they never explicitly mentioned Clare. Without something concrete tying him to the alleyway in January 1993, the Crown Prosecution Service could not risk a trial. The stakes were too high. If he were acquitted because of insufficient evidence, he could never be charged again for the same crime, even if more evidence emerged later. So Kent police did what they had been forced to do for years. They continued to watch, to search, to wait. Meanwhile, the legal consequences for the 1988 and 1995 attacks unfolded swiftly. In December 1996, Colin was convicted and sentenced to 3 life terms. The courtroom heard detailed accounts of his crimes, including his admission that he had gone out on the night Charlotte Barnard was attacked because he believed his girlfriend was cheating on him. In a fit of violent jealousy, he drove aimlessly until he saw Charlotte walking alone, a woman he had never met. He initially considered attacking a man out of raw anger, but then thought, "A woman will do." Those words echoed long after his sentencing. Colin spoke casually of the relief he felt after stabbing Charlotte, as though the act had purged his emotional turmoil. He admitted he had no concern for whether she lived or died. He went home, he hid the knife, and then he went out to a pub to play pool. For the court, for the jury, for the public, this detail was damning. It showed a man who could commit brutal violence and then reintegrate into ordinary life, untroubled, unshaken. It showed a predator who blended into community spaces with deceptive ease. For Clare's parents, Cliff and Linda Tiltman, the conviction brought no closure. They attended every day of Colin's trial, listening to the horrors he admitted committing, and believing with unwavering certainty that he had taken their daughter's life. But without a charge, without a verdict, they remained trapped in an agonizing limbo. Their grief was compounded when it emerged that Colin's father, Aubrey Ash Smith, had intervened in the investigation. Fearing his son's knife could connect him to Clare's murder, Aubrey had taken one of Colin's knives, possibly the very one used in the attack, boiled it to remove any trace of blood, dismantled it, and disposed of its pieces. For this, he was later convicted of perverting the course of justice. Even more astonishingly, Colin's mother, Diane, openly admitted in a television interview that she was the one who had urged Aubrey to get rid of the knife. Whether she faced charges remains murky, but the revelation damaged the family's reputation irreparably. Detectives were left wondering whether the Ash-Smith parents had known, or at least suspected, what their son was capable of. Had they protected him out of parental loyalty, out of fear, out of denial, or had they understood the truth and chosen silence over justice? The answers died with them. As the 1990s drew to a close, Clare's case remained on the books but stagnant. The original case file grew to more than 40,000 pages. Every few years, investigators would revisit the evidence, hoping advances in forensic science might unlock new clues. They tested fibers, tested bloodstains, examined Clare's clothing again, and searched for DNA profiles that had not been detectable before. But nothing emerged that could tie Colin directly to the murder. The Tiltman family continued to grieve. Clare's parents remained active in the community, attending memorial events, speaking to the press, visiting the alley where she was attacked. But time, which sometimes dulls grief, only sharpened their sense of loss. Clare's absence permeated everything: birthdays, holidays, ordinary days. In 2003, more than 10 years after the murder, a memorial plaque was mounted on a wall near the alley. For many, it was a physical reminder of the tragedy, a sign that Clare had not been forgotten. But the plaque was vandalized, ripped down and defaced. Friends and locals joined to restore it, determined not to allow disrespect to overshadow Clare's memory. Around the same time, changes in English law quietly opened a new door. The Criminal Justice Act, 2003, allowed courts to admit bad character evidence, meaning a defendant's history of similar crimes could be presented to jurors in a new case. Before this change, such evidence was usually excluded to prevent prejudice. But now, if prosecutors could argue that a defendant's past actions were relevant to current charges, they could bring it in. It was a significant shift. For the first time, the crimes of 1988 and 1995 could potentially be used as context in a trial for Clare's murder. Still, the CPS needed more. The diaries, the escalation of attacks, the geographic pattern these created an overwhelming narrative. But narratives alone do not convict. Proof is needed. Something that tied Colin to Clare's death not just in pattern, but in action. For nearly a decade, the case remained open yet immovable, caught between what investigators believed and what they could prove. As more time passed, hope dimmed. Clare's mother became ill, Years of grief took their toll. She died in 2008, never seeing her daughter's killer charged. Her father, Cliff, soldiered on, but his health deteriorated too. In interviews, he spoke of crying for hours alone in his home, missing his daughter and his wife, the silence of the house unbearable. He told reporters he would never give up hope, but hope does not protect the heart indefinitely. Cliff Tiltman died in September 2012, just months shy of the 20th anniversary of Clare's murder. Neither parent lived to see justice. Their deaths struck Kent police with a renewed sense of urgency. Detective Chief Inspector Rob Vinson, leading a cold case review, said publicly, "A good man has gone to his grave without ever seeing justice for his daughter." The cold case review team intensified their work. They revisited every statement, every piece of evidence, every interview. And as they sifted through it all, a name emerged again. A man called Stefan, a former cellmate of Colin's. He had once told police that Colin had described an attack on a girl near a zebra crossing. It was a detail that had never been made public, a detail that matched the area where Clare had been stabbed. Detectives visited him again and obtained a new statement. If true, it was the missing piece, the bridge between suspicion and evidence. With that new information, police returned to the Ash Smith home in 2013, searching once more. In the attic, tucked among Colin's old belongings, they found a 1994 newspaper, an anniversary piece about Clare's murder. Why had he kept it? Why had he saved that one? It was not a smoking gun. But in the eyes of the law, it was enough. 21 years after the murder, in February 2014, the Crown Prosecution Service announced that Colin Ash Smith would be charged with the murder of Clare Tiltman. The news rippled across Kent like a long-awaited storm. The trial, when it came, would be one of the most emotional in local memory. It would revisit 2 decades of pain, lies, violence, and unanswered questions. And finally, it would bring the truth into the light. By the time 21 years had passed since the night Clare Tiltman was murdered, the town of Greenhithe had absorbed the tragedy into its collective memory. People still walked London Road, still passed the turnoff toward the narrow alley, still crossed the zebra crossing, where Clare had taken her final steps toward danger, but the shadow of what had happened never disappeared. It lingered, gently but insistently, like the memory of a striking cold wind that had blown through and changed the temperature of a place forever. Those who had lived in Greenhithe in the early 1990s remembered Clare not just as a name on a plaque, but as a living young girl full of promise, someone they'd known or seen or heard about. They remembered the community's fear, the police roadblocks, the vigils, the unanswered questions. They remembered the whispers about the Ash Smith family, the troubled young man with the white Ford Capri, the diaries full of rage and violence, the suspicion that never seemed to settle comfortably into certainty. And still, for 2 decades, no one had been able to stand in a court of law and say with legal precision, Clare Tiltman was killed by Colin Ash Smith. That changed on the 12th day of February, 2014. It was a gray winter morning when Kent Police and the Crown Prosecution Service issued their joint statement. After a lengthy review of evidence and witness accounts new and old, they had concluded that there was now sufficient evidence to charge Colin Ash Smith with Clare's murder. Investigators had found the missing narrative threads, the small but crucial pieces of information that, when woven together, transformed speculation into a case strong enough for a jury to consider. The timing was striking. By then, Colin had served 18 years of his life sentence for the 1988 and 1995 attacks. He was due for a parole hearing that very day. But instead of discussing the possibility of release, he was informed he would now face trial for murder. It was, in many ways, fate intervening. Detective Superintendent Rob Vinson, the lead officer on the cold case team, spoke with measured solemnity. "We never gave up on Clare. Never. Not once in 21 years. With the charges filed, preparations began for a trial that would unearth 2 decades of evidence, tragedy, and deception. And as those preparations quietly unfolded, Clare's old friends and classmates, now adults in their mid-30s, braced themselves. They had grown up. They had families and careers, but they had never stopped being 16 on some level, never stopped missing Clare, never stopped thinking about the life she never got to live. Now, they were preparing to step back into the past, into the grief of their adolescence, to sit in a courtroom and watch justice finally reach the man they had always suspected. On the 6th day of November, 2014, at Inner London Crown Court, the trial of Colin Ash-Smith began. More than 2 decades had passed since the events being discussed, and the courtroom carried an unusual mixture of old pain and new resolve. Clare's parents could not be there. Both Cliff and Linda had died before seeing this day. Their absence added a heaviness to the atmosphere, a sense of injustice that lingered even beyond the case itself. But Clare's friends filled the seats they would have occupied. They brought framed photographs of Cliff and Linda, placing them close, as if the couple could somehow witness what was finally unfolding. Colin Ash-Smith, now in his mid-40s, stood in the dock and pleaded not guilty. The prosecution, led by Queen's Counsel Brian Altman, wasted no time in painting a portrait of the man they said had killed Clare, a man filled with violent impulses, misogynistic fantasies, and an obsessive relationship with knives. A man who had carried out at least 2 other frenzied stabbings in the same region. A man who had written his violent thoughts in diaries with disturbing clarity. And a man who had been near the scene, had lied to police, and had woven an alibi that no longer held together under scrutiny. But above all, Altman described Clare's murder as a killing for the sake of killing. No robbery, no provocation, no sexual assault. Just the singular, purposeful act of stabbing a 16-year-old girl to death. It was this motiveless nature that tied the case so tightly to the pattern of Ash-Smith's confirmed attacks. The 1988 and 1995 incidents had both been unprovoked, frenzied, and rooted in rage. The parallels were undeniable. In earlier decades, the prosecution would have faced an impossible barrier. They would not have been allowed to present Colin's past crimes or diaries to the jury, as such evidence could unfairly prejudice their opinion. But because of the Criminal Justice Act 2003, Colin's own history was now admissible if prosecutors could demonstrate its relevance, and they did. The jury heard about the quarry attack of 1988. They heard about Charlotte Barnard's stabbing in 1995. They heard about the violent fantasies Colin meticulously wrote in his diaries, about his stalking behavior, his obsession with knives, and the graphic, disturbing detail with which he described women he targeted or wished to target. The prosecution argued that these crimes and fantasies formed a clear signature, a pattern of behavior that made Colin overwhelmingly likely to be the person who killed Clare. This was not coincidence, they argued. This was the evolution of a serial offender. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence came from Colin's former cellmate, known publicly under a pseudonym to protect his identity. In 2013, he had told police that Colin once described attacking a girl near a zebra crossing. It was a detail never released publicly, and the location matched Clare's final route. During the trial, the cellmate took the stand. At first, he was confident in what he'd told the police. But under cross-examination, he became vague, even apologetic, suggesting he might have confused Colin's words with those of another prisoner. He joked about Colin's stabbing accuracy, drew laughter inappropriately, and then admitted medication had made his memory unreliable. His inconsistency shook the room slightly. The defense pounced on it. But even with the cellmates wavering, the prosecution still had a mountain of evidence to lean on: the diaries, the pattern of offenses, the proximity, the lies, and the motive of control and dominance. Colin's lawyers attempted a strategy familiar in cases involving violent stabbings from the same era. They pointed to the notorious serial killer Robert Napper. Napper had committed murders involving multiple stab wounds and was active in the general region during the early 1990s. Could he have been Clare's killer? The defense suggested. The prosecution quickly dismantled the argument. Napper's crimes followed different patterns. His victims were sexually assaulted, something that had not occurred with Clare. There was no evidence he had been in Kent that night. And the brutality of his attacks, while similar superficially, did not match the signature elements of Ash-Smith's behavior. The jury saw through the redirection. Colin himself testified. What emerged was a portrait of a man attempting to present himself as sensitive, misunderstood, and remorseful. Except the remorse never seemed to focus on the acts he committed. Rather, he seemed sorry for himself. He spoke of insecurity, of feeling powerless, of women making him feel inferior. He admitted he liked women but also despised them. He claimed he walked with knives at night not to hurt people, but because he wanted someone to attack him. A bizarre claim that contradicted everything in his diaries. He insisted he had nothing to do with Clare's murder. And then, in a moment that tightened the air in the courtroom, he said he had grown close to Clare's parents after her murder, and that he had wanted to kill Clare's murderer himself. It was a chilling performance, because the more he spoke, the more the courtroom felt the weight of what he wasn't saying. Witnesses recalled that at Clare's funeral, Colin wore a light-colored jacket that matched the early descriptions of the man seen near the alley the night she died. Photographs supported this, and while that alone wasn't proof, it painted a disturbing picture. The killer attending the funeral wearing the same jacket he had worn while committing the crime. People who knew Colin at the time recalled he became withdrawn after Clare's murder. He stopped going to the British Legion Club, a place he frequented regularly until they put up pictures of Clare. Then he kept away. His mother's behavior also drew attention. A fellow counselor testified that she had been unusually focused on asking police what they knew about a specific vehicle suspected in the murder. That vehicle was later identified as a white Ford Capri, the same car Colin drove. Perhaps the darkest moment of the trial came when the prosecution read portions of Colin's diaries aloud. His own words echoed through the courtroom, the fantasies of control, the missions he planned, the women he followed. He described his victims not as people but as opportunities. He wrote of power like an intoxication. He referred to the 1988 attack not as a crime but as my masterpiece. He wrote, "Afterwards I felt strong, like someone else entirely. I want to feel in control of someone, not a doormat. One day, I'll get it perfect." These were not the writings of a misunderstood man. They were the confessions of a predator who saw violence as liberation. Throughout the trial, Clare's friends sat together, holding one another's hands. They were not children anymore. They were women now. Some with families of their own. But every time the details of the murder were discussed, they became 16 again, frightened, stunned, broken by the memory of losing someone they loved. One of Clare's cousins suffered a stroke during the proceedings, the stress proving too much. He survived, but the moment underscored the emotional toll the case still carried, even 21 years later. After 5 weeks, the jury retired to deliberate. The courtroom emptied slightly, leaving behind the echo of everything said, every image, every memory. Every piece of evidence collected since 1993. They deliberated for just 3.5 hours. When they returned, the silence was thick enough to weigh on the air. Colin Ash Smith was told to stand. The foreman delivered the verdict. Guilty of the murder of Clare Tiltman. After 21 years of suspicion, grief, and searching, the truth had at last been confirmed. Clare Tiltman's killer had a name. He had always had a name, and justice, though long delayed, had finally reached him. When the verdict was read, a quiet shudder passed through the courtroom. The kind of subtle but unmistakable ripple that moves through a room when something enormous, long-awaited, and irreversible finally comes to pass. Some cried. Others simply bowed their heads with relief so profound it seemed to knock the air from their lungs. Clare's friends held hands tightly, their shoulders trembling with the mixture of victory and sorrow that only comes from earning justice long after the people who deserve to witness it are gone. They exchanged looks heavy with memory, looks that said, silently, "We did it, Clare. We didn't stop." Colin Ash Smith showed no reaction. He simply stood there, face blank, as though the verdict had been delivered to someone else entirely. After weeks of listening to the details of his violence, after days of hearing his own words spoken back to him from diaries he once seemed proud of, he remained impassive. Perhaps it was shock, perhaps it was arrogance, or perhaps it was the final expression of the cold detachment that had defined so much of his life. He was to be sentenced the following day, but he refused to attend. He would not come into the courtroom, even under guard. He refused to appear on a video link. He refused to listen to the victim impact statements prepared by Clare's family and friends. He refused to face the judge, who would impose a sentence meant not only to punish him, but to honor the life he had taken. In the end, he remained in the cells beneath the court, choosing silence over accountability, a fitting symbol of the cowardice that had run through every chapter of his violence. The judge proceeded without him. The courtroom filled again, though this time the energy was different. There was still grief, still emotion, but now an undercurrent of resolution flowed beneath it. A sense of completion. a sense that the long, painful search had finally reached its destination. Justice Sweeney, who had presided with meticulous care throughout the trial, delivered the sentence in firm, measured words. He imposed a life sentence with a minimum term of 21 years, to run consecutively to the life terms Colin was already serving. The judge stated plainly that he had no doubt the murder was premeditated, that Colin had attacked Clare with the intent to kill, and that he had shown no remorse whatsoever. He spoke, too, of the unbearable grief the Tiltman family had endured, acknowledging the tragic reality that Clare's parents had not lived to see this day. Their absence hung over the courtroom like a silent echo. The judge paused, allowing that truth to settle in the air, and those sitting in the gallery felt the weight of what had been lost. Cliff and Linda had waited for answers for nearly 20 years. Now, at last, the truth had been spoken aloud in a court of law, and they were not there to hear it. Clare's friends had prepared statements for the court, and though they were read aloud without her parents present, the words carried the full force of a family's grief. Lisa, Clare's best friend, wrote about the decades of wandering, the nights that never fully passed without Clare's face appearing in memory, the birthdays and milestones Clare never reached. She wrote about how Clare had been loved, truly loved, and how her absence had changed all of them. Another relative spoke on behalf of the family, describing how the murder had torn apart an entire lineage. Clare was an only child. Cliff and Linda never recovered from losing her. Their deaths, years apart, had been shadowed by a grief that hollowed them out from the inside. He said it plainly, the night Clare was murdered, the hopes and dreams of our entire family ended too. Outside the courtroom, the Justice for Clare group friends, who had spent years fighting to keep her case alive, addressed the media. Their voices shook, but they spoke with certainty. They said Clare was finally getting the justice she deserved. They thanked the detectives who had never abandoned the case, even when it went cold, even when leads dried up, even when comfort might have come from moving on. They praised the prosecutors whose careful work had brought the case back to life. They said they wished more than anything that Clare's parents could have been there to hear the verdict, but they believed Cliff and Linda were at peace now, knowing the truth had been revealed. In interviews that followed, many people were struck by the deep dignity with which Clare's friends spoke. They talked about how the trial had brought everything back, the shock of being teenagers hearing the news of Clare's death, the funeral, the fear that settled over the community afterwards. They said sitting through the trial had been like reopening an old wound, but doing so was necessary. Justice required it. Clare deserved nothing less. Even after the verdict, people still wondered about the extent to which Colin's parents had known what he was capable of. His mother had admitted on television to ordering her husband to get rid of a knife after the murder. His father had been convicted for destroying potential evidence. During the trial, testimony revealed that his mother had asked persistent, almost frantic questions at a counsel briefing about whether the police were looking for a specific type of car. Witnesses recalled the unease with which she asked, as though fishing for information. It raised uncomfortable questions. Had she suspected? Had she known? Or had denial blinded her to a truth she could not bear to face? The answers were buried with them, destined never to be fully understood. In the months after the conviction, attention slowly shifted back toward the community and how it might honor Clare's memory. Greenhithe and Stone had held on to the story of Clare for more than 20 years, and now that justice had finally arrived, there was a desire to give her legacy something positive, something lasting, something that would stand long after the trial faded from memory. Roads were renamed in her honor. Clare Tiltman Avenue. Later, Fast Track's Manor Way was renamed Tiltman Avenue. A memorial bench was installed. A community center would eventually bear her name. These were acts of remembrance, but also acts of reclamation, turning the scene of tragedy into a place of tribute. It wasn't only official memorials that grew. Her friends carried Clare with them in quieter ways. Some planted roses for her, some kept framed photos in their homes. Others visited the memorial site quietly, lighting candles on anniversaries or simply standing there, thinking about the girl they had known and loved. For them, Clare was not a story or a symbol. She was a friend, a daughter, a girl who had laughed, danced, dreamed of becoming a firefighter, worried about exams, and looked forward to the future. Those memories lived on, and the conviction of her killer allowed them to remember her more softly, without the shadow of an unanswered question haunting every recollection. Colin's appeal came the following year. His lawyers argued that the inclusion of his previous crimes and diary entries had unfairly prejudiced the jury. They said the case had been built on character rather than evidence. They said the judge had erred, but the Court of Appeal dismissed the attempt swiftly. The ruling stated the case was unarguable, a decisive rejection. The conviction stood, the appeals pathway closed. And for the first time since 1993, the legal chapter of Clare's story was complete. In April 2016, Colin's father, Aubrey, died. There were debates within the prison system about whether Colin should be permitted to attend the funeral under escort. Many argued he should not have that privilege when Clare's parents never saw justice. Ultimately, he did not attend. His absence felt symbolic, another reminder of how violence ripples far beyond its moment, affecting families in ways that reverberate for years. In the time that followed, the story of Clare Tiltman continued to be told. Documentaries, long-form articles, true crime features each retold her life and the fight for justice that spanned decades. These retellings mattered not because they sensationalized tragedy, but because they preserved memory. They ensured Clare would never be just another statistic on a police report. She remained a daughter, a friend, a classmate, a young woman with her entire life ahead of her. They reminded people of the resilience of her family and friends, the persistence of investigators, and the eventual triumph of truth. Today, if you walk through Greenhithe or Stone, you might pass along streets carrying Clare's name. You might see the memorial bench, the plaque, the community center. You might notice the roses planted in her honor. They are quiet signs, gentle reminders that Clare remains part of the community she once called home. The places she walked are still there. The corners of her life remain stitched into the landscape. Her story, though heartbreaking, has become a testament to perseverance. For those who knew Clare, there is comfort in knowing her case did not fade away. They take solace in the knowledge that she was never forgotten, and that justice, though slow, though painful, though delayed by years, arrived with the full force of truth. They live with the grief, but they also live with the memory of Clare's laughter, her dreams, her kindness. They carry forward the promise that her life, though cut short, will always matter. And now, through stories like this, through the retelling of her case on platforms like the Criminal Schema, Clare Tiltman continues to be remembered by thousands more people who never knew her but who feel the weight of her story, who hear her name, who honor her in their own way, by listening, learning, and refusing to let her fade into silence. When the trial ended and the cameras packed away, when the reporters filed their pieces and the legal teams returned to their routines, the world outside the courtroom did something the justice system rarely has the luxury of doing. It paused and breathed. For the people whose lives had been anchored to Clare Tiltman's murder, the world felt different now. The fear that had lived in the corners of their minds for more than 2 decades loosened its grip. The suspense was over. The question that had haunted them, who killed Clare, now had a name backed by a verdict that no appeal would overturn. But justice, once delivered, does not erase the years that came before it. It coexists with them, an answer layered on top of scars still healing. In the days following the sentencing, local papers published reflections from journalists who had covered the case since the early 90s. They wrote about how rare it was for a cold case to come full circle after so many years, especially one so lacking in forensic evidence. They praised the investigators who had persisted. They spoke with quiet admiration for Clare's friends, the ones who had grown up and grown older while carrying the memory of a girl frozen forever at 16. They noted that Greenhithe, once a quiet riverside town, had kept Clare's story alive with a kind of stubborn tenderness. Around town, people stood a little longer at the memorial bench, tracing the engraved letters of Clare's name with their fingertips. The bench was simple, modest, the kind of place where an afternoon walker might sit for a moment without realizing its significance unless they already knew the story. The bench faced a quiet stretch of greenery, a place where the world felt calm. It was not hidden, not loud, simply present. A place for remembering. The alley where Clare died remained unchanged in structure, but it had taken on a different atmosphere. For years, people avoided it, choosing longer routes or walking around the block rather than pass through a space that held such a terrible history. Even after the murder was solved, The alley remained a place where footsteps slowed and voices fell quiet. Not out of fear anymore, but out of respect, almost reverence. Locals sometimes left flowers at the entrance. Teenagers who hadn't been born when Clare was killed walked past it in groups and whispered the story passed down from older siblings or parents. The alley became part of the communal identity of Greenhithe, a symbol of loss and resilience. As winter turned to spring, a peculiar quiet settled across the community. It wasn't the silence of fear, but the stillness that comes after a storm. Those who had been directly involved in the case, detectives, analysts, prosecutors, support workers, found themselves thinking about Clare at unexpected moments. Detectives who had worked the original investigation remembered the frustration of the early months, the fading leads, the phone calls that went nowhere. They remembered interviewing Colin Ash-Smith in the mid-90s, watching him deny involvement with a composure that now seemed sinister in hindsight. Some of them admitted privately that they had always suspected him. But suspicion is not evidence, and the gap between those two things had been agonizingly wide for decades. The cold case team who revived the investigation felt a different sort of weight. They had cracked open files that had gathered dust since the early 90s, reread statements written on typewriters, re-examined photographs that had faded slightly with age, scrutinized every line of every diary entry Colin had ever written. When they found the former cellmate willing to retell the zebra crossing detail, they felt something shift inside the investigation, a sensation investigators rarely experience, the unmistakable feeling of a door opening after years of silence. For them, solving the case had been both a triumph and a heartbreak. They celebrated the verdict with quiet satisfaction, but they also felt the sting of knowing Clare's parents had died before they could hear the truth spoken aloud. In interviews, several officers said the same thing. Justice had been delivered, but too late for the two people who deserved it most. Even in victory, there was grief. The story spread beyond Kent. True crime discussions online revisited the case. Former classmates of Clare wrote posts sharing memories of her, describing how she had been cheerful, helpful, always laughing in the corridors between classes. People who had barely known her, someone who had been a younger student, or someone who had worked at a local shop, shared recollections of brief interactions. It was a strange, beautiful testament to how deeply Clare had touched lives, even in small, fleeting ways. These memories bloomed across forums, blogs, and social media pages. They were little snapshots of a girl frozen in time, held tenderly by those who still remembered her. In stone, the staff of the community center that now bore Clare's name spoke about her with an almost familial warmth. Even though many of them had not known her personally, they said her story inspired the programs they ran, especially those focused on youth engagement and community safety. On the anniversary of her death each year, flowers appeared outside the center's entrance, sometimes from people who signed their names, sometimes from anonymous mourners who left quiet tokens of remembrance. The schools in the surrounding towns continued to teach lessons about personal safety, but now they did so with Clare's story woven into the conversation not as a cautionary tale designed to frighten, but as a reminder of why communities must look out for one another. Teachers who had known Clare often spoke of her with a fondness that softened their voices. Students who had grown up hearing about the case understood that Clare had not simply been a victim, she had been a teenager like them, with friendships, dreams, and a whole life ahead of her. Even those who had no personal connection to Clare found themselves affected by the case. Taxi drivers, pub owners, local counselors, they all remembered where they were when they first heard the news in 1993. They remembered the atmosphere of fear that followed. They remembered the long years of uncertainty. And they remembered the collective sigh of relief, or grief, or both, when the verdict finally came through. In a quiet house near the outskirts of Stone, one of the original paramedics who had responded to the scene of Clare's attack still kept a small token from that night tucked away in a drawer. Not evidence, something personal, something symbolic. He rarely spoke of the case, but on the day of the verdict, he told a reporter that he had never forgotten Clare's face, never forgotten the determination she showed in those final moments, fighting to reach the road, fighting to be found. He said that even after decades of emergency service work, there were some calls that stayed with you forever. Clare's was one of them. Not everyone found closure easily. Some of Clare's friends struggled with the emotional aftermath of the trial. They spoke privately about the images described in court, the diary excerpts read aloud, the coldness in Colin's voice as he tried to explain his violence. They admitted that hearing the details forced them to visualize moments they had spent their entire adult lives trying to avoid. They felt relief, yes, but also exhaustion, a deep emotional fatigue from carrying Claire's memory for so many years. Several sought counseling afterward, hoping to reconcile the relief of justice with the resurgence of old trauma. Claire's extended family, those who had survived the decades of waiting, found themselves returning to old photo albums. They looked at Claire as a child, as a toddler grinning at the camera, as a schoolgirl in uniform smiling shyly. They looked at the pictures from her 16th birthday meal, the last celebration she ever had. They talked about what she might have done with her life. Would she have gone into firefighting, the field she had loved through her volunteer work? Would she have traveled, married, had children? Those questions had no answers, and yet they surfaced, again and again. Because imagining the life Claire never lived was a way of expressing the grief that still lingered beneath the surface. The detectives who had worked the case spoke candidly about the unsettling realization that Colin had moved through life unnoticed for so long. In the early 90s, he had been a young man with a girlfriend, a job, a car, and a family deeply rooted in local politics. He attended social events. He volunteered. He walked among people who considered him unremarkable. That, investigators said, was the most chilling part: how ordinary he appeared, how easily he blended into the background of everyday life. Those who knew him in the early 90s, or thought they knew him, grappled with guilt. They looked back on conversations, gestures, offhand comments, wondering if they had missed something. A former colleague remembered that Colin often wore large jackets, even in mild weather. Someone else remembered seeing him linger around bus stops. A girl from school recalled he had once followed her home for several minutes. None of these things had seemed significant at the time. Now they felt like flashing warning signs in hindsight, though hindsight always sharpens what the present blurs. In prison, Colin was returned to the life he had already been living: routine, restrictions, silence. His conviction for Claire's murder made him even more isolated. Other inmates viewed him with disdain, not because of the violence, but because of the cruelty of attacking teenage girls, because of the calculated nature of his crimes, because of his smugness during his earlier years behind bars. Prison hierarchies have their own logic, and Colin found himself regarded with contempt by nearly everyone around him. The staff noted he showed no remorse after the conviction. He spoke little of the trial, and when he did, he framed it as a misunderstanding or an overreaction by the authorities. He insisted he was innocent of Claire's murder, despite the mountain of evidence and the court's verdict. His denial was not unexpected. It seemed less like a defense and more like a pattern, another lie built into his character. Meanwhile, the community found healing in small steps. In Stone, renovations began on the community center that bore Claire's name. Volunteers painted walls, installed lighting, added new programs for teens. They wanted the center to reflect Claire's spirit: friendly, open, full of potential. On the day of the rededication ceremony, locals gathered in the hall, with soft music playing in the background. Photographs of Claire lined a table at the entrance. A candle was lit beside a framed picture of her, smiling in her school uniform. People spoke about her life, not just her death. They talked about her love for volunteering, her kindness, her loyalty as a friend. They spoke her name in a way that felt warm, not mournful. Outside, a freshly planted rosebush bloomed near the entrance. It was a gift from Claire's old friends, a living tribute that would grow year after year, marking her presence not as a memory fading into the past, but as something living, growing, and deeply rooted. And in Greenhithe, on a quiet morning in early summer, a woman walked along Tiltman Avenue with her young daughter. The little girl pointed at the street sign and asked, "Who is that?" The mother slowed her step, thinking carefully, then said, "She was someone brave, someone the whole town loved," and they walked on. In the weeks that followed the conviction of Colin Ashe Smith, the town of Greenhithe seemed to move through a period of quiet reflection, as though the community itself were processing the weight of the verdict in slow, thoughtful breaths. Conversations in cafes, bus stops, corner shops, and school gates circled back to Clare Tiltman's case, with a gentleness that contrasted sharply against the brutality of the crime. People spoke about justice, about grief, about memory. They spoke about the long reach of tragedy and the equally long reach of perseverance. And they spoke about Clare, not in the hushed, uncertain tones that had filled the early years after her murder, but with the warm, open remembrance that comes when a wound, though still tender, has finally begun to heal. Life in the surrounding towns had changed since the 1990s. New houses stood where vacant lots once sat. Old pubs had been converted into restaurants. Roads had been widened and bus routes restructured. Yet there were places where time had barely brushed the landscape. The alley where Clare was attacked, the railway arches where Charlotte Barnard survived her assault, and the chalk quarries beyond town where the 1988 victim had endured her own nightmare. These locations had become part of the community's silent geography, landmarks of tragedy that people passed with a mixture of respect, sorrow, and uneasy memory. In the quiet hours of the morning, before traffic thickened and the world stirred fully awake, the alley looked almost ordinary. A narrow cut between walls, a short shadowed passage that connected two long residential roads. In daylight, there was nothing remarkable about it, no sign, no plaque, no marker of what had happened there. But people still felt something in the air as they walked through it. Many avoided it entirely. Those who did walk it often did so briskly, shoulders slightly tense. Trauma leaves echoes, and this alley echoed loudly. One woman who lived nearby told a reporter that she couldn't bring herself to step into the alley until after the verdict. Once Colin was convicted, she forced herself to walk through it one morning as the sun rose. She said the experience felt strangely liberating, as though she were reclaiming a small, important part of her community that had been overshadowed for years. It didn't feel scary anymore, she explained. It felt sad, but not frightening. Like it belonged to Clare again, not to him. There was something gently symbolic in the way people described that shift. After the verdict, the spaces associated with the crime no longer felt like territory marked by an unknown predator. They felt like places reclaimed slowly, quietly by those who had loved Clare, and by a community that had refused to let her memory fade. Detectives who had worked on the cold case found themselves revisiting their own memories too. Some spoke privately about the moment they realized, years earlier, that Colin might be the killer. They remembered his contradictory statements, the uneasy way he answered certain questions, the unsettling assortment of knives he kept. They remembered thinking, again and again, that something wasn't right with him. But suspicion was one thing, evidence was another. One retired officer, who had been part of the original inquiry in 1993, said he used to lie awake at night, replaying the early interviews with Colin. He remembered the young man's awkward mannerisms, his uneven tone, the way he seemed simultaneously eager to be helpful and strangely guarded. The officer had tucked these impressions away as things to revisit when the investigation allowed. It had taken more than 20 years for those early doubts to solidify into proof. During interviews after the case concluded, several detectives reflected on how easily a killer like Colin could hide in plain sight. He wasn't charismatic, he wasn't socially adept, he didn't draw attention to himself. Instead, he blended into the background, a quiet man with a job, a girlfriend, a family known in local politics. He volunteered, he played pool, he attended community events. He walked among the very people who later realized they had stood beside a predator without knowing it. This realization unsettled many. It made people question how well they knew their neighbors, acquaintances, colleagues. It made them think about intuition, the subtle signals we sometimes ignore because they seem too small to matter. Some wondered whether anyone had sensed something off about him before his crimes escalated. A former classmate admitted she remembered Colin staring at her once, in a way that felt too long, too blank. She told herself at the time that she must have misinterpreted it. Now she wondered if that moment foreshadowed something darker beneath his calm surface. Others recalled small, peculiar habits, his fascination with knives, his willingness to show them off, his enthusiasm for late-night walks. A former co-worker said he once saw Colin sharpening a blade in the break room at work. When he asked why, Colin shrugged and said he liked keeping things ready. It seemed odd, but not alarming back then. After the trial, that memory replayed in the man's mind with a chill he couldn't shake. While the community processed its collective memory, Clare's circle of friends processed the more personal layers of grief and relief that came with the conviction. Some described the days after the verdict as strangely emotional, not only because justice had finally been delivered, but because the trial had forced them to relive memories they thought they had buried. They had sat in court as the events of 1993 were reassembled piece by piece. They listened to witness accounts, evidence summaries, diary excerpts. They heard the prosecutors describe Clare's final minutes. They listened as the defense attempted to cast doubt. They watched Colin sit there, unchanged by the passage of time. Unchanged by remorse. One friend said it felt like being 17 again, sitting in a school assembly as teachers told them what had happened. Only now, they were adults, with families, responsibilities, entire lives, built in the shadow of a tragedy that still shaped them. During the trial, they felt the weight of both versions of themselves, the teenagers who had lost their friend, and the adults who had finally seen the truth confirmed. In the days after the conviction, they found themselves talking about Clare in ways they hadn't in years. Not out of avoidance, but because the fear of not knowing had finally lifted. They shared stories about her habit of cracking jokes during study sessions, about the way she danced to her favorite songs, about her determination to become a firefighter even when people underestimated her. They talked about her infectious laugh, her loyalty, her love for her parents. They remembered her birthdays, her smile, her plans. One friend admitted she had kept a box of Clare's letters and small gifts tucked away in her loft for decades. After the verdict, she brought the box down, dusted it off, and reread every note Clare had written to her. In one letter, Clare had talked excitedly about their upcoming GCSEs and their hopes for college. The words felt frozen in time, untouched by tragedy. They reminded her of everything Clare had been, and everything she should have lived to become. Clare's extended family, though smaller now, found comfort in the way the community rallied around her memory. They received messages from former classmates, teachers, neighbors, and even strangers who had followed the case from afar. Some wrote about how Clare's story had stayed with them for decades. Others wrote about how they had watched the verdict with tears in their eyes, grateful that justice had finally been carried out. In the Tiltman household, now kept by extended relatives, there were objects that had become treasured memorials. Clare's school portrait, her certificates, her Duke of Edinburgh award logs, her volunteer badge from the fire station, the framed photograph of her in uniform, and above all, the photograph of Clare with her parents, smiling in a garden, sunlight on their faces. That picture now represented a moment untouched by tragedy, a small eternal circle of love. The fire station where Clare had volunteered held its own remembrance. Several firefighters who had known her in the early 90s had since retired, but some returned that week to honor her memory. They placed fresh flowers beneath the small framed tribute that had hung there ever since her death. Younger firefighters asked older ones about Clare, what she had been like, how she had worked, what she had dreamed. They listened as her story was retold, with a mix of pride and sadness. Not far away, a retired paramedic found himself revisiting the scene in his mind. He remembered the cold pavement, the frantic minutes of CPR, the determination to keep Clare alive. He remembered her eyes, barely open. He remembered the silence that followed. He said he had carried that night with him through every call that came after, through every emergency, through every moment he wondered whether he had done enough. The conviction did not erase the memory, but it softened it, allowing him to finally feel that the story had reached its rightful end. Within the police department, a small informal gathering was held to acknowledge the officers who had contributed to solving the case across 2 decades. Retired detectives were invited alongside current ones. They spoke about DCI Owen Taylor, the original lead investigator who had died in the late 1990s. They talked about how devoted he had been to finding Clare's killer, how he had immersed himself in the case to a degree that bordered on personal guardianship. Some said Owen would have been proud that his work had not been in vain. Others said he would have been heartbroken that Clare's parents did not live to see justice. But all agreed he deserved recognition for laying the groundwork that later teams built upon. During the gathering, one officer raised a quiet toast, not loud, not formal, simply heartfelt. "To Clare," he said, "and to everyone who refused to let her story go cold." That sentiment echoed what people around Greenhithe had felt for years, that justice had come, not because of luck, but because so many refused to look away, refused to let the memory fade, refused to let the truth slip through the cracks of time. Yet even with closure, the legacy of the case remained textured with both sorrow and strength. Parents in the area spoke more openly with their children about personal safety, about intuition, about trusting their instincts. Schools incorporated new lessons on awareness and community responsibility. Teenagers growing up in the 2010s and 2020s heard Clare's story not as a frightening tale, but as a reminder of vigilance, unity, and the importance of speaking up. The story also made its way into academic discussions about criminal psychology. Experts analyzed Colin's diaries, his patterns, his escalation from fantasy to action. They studied the role of community awareness, investigative persistence, and cold case review protocols. Clare's case became a reference point in lectures, police training modules, and criminology courses. It served as an example of how dangerous offenders can hide behind facades of normalcy, and how justice can still prevail, even when years pass without resolution. Journalists, too, continued to revisit the case. True crime writers produced long-form articles exploring its complexities. Documentaries highlighted the decades-long pursuit of the truth. Many noted how rare it was for a case to endure such a long struggle and still reach a conclusion. Others focused on the human stories intertwined with the investigation, the grief of the Tiltmans, the determination of Clare's friends, the resilience of survivors, the tenacity of detectives. Across these retellings, one theme remained constant: that justice, even delayed, still matters deeply. That communities do not forget. That victims deserve their stories told with empathy and dignity. And that those left behind deserve answers, no matter how long they take to arrive. In one particularly moving interview, a former classmate of Clare's said something that resonated with many. "Clare wasn't just our friend. She became a symbol of why you don't give up on people, on truth, on justice. We fought for Clare because we loved her, but also because she deserved to have her story finished, not left hanging in the dark." Her words captured a truth that had steadily defined the case, that justice is not only a legal concept, but an act of remembrance, of honor, of collective responsibility. And so, as the seasons changed and years moved forward, Clare's memory did not dim. It transformed, becoming a living, breathing part of the community's identity. Her name appeared on street signs, benches, community centers. Roses were planted in her honor. Candles were lit on anniversaries. Stories were shared with new generations. And somewhere in the heart of Greenhithe and Stone, Clare Tiltman's legacy endured not as a victim frozen in tragedy, but as a young woman whose life, though cut short, inspired a community to stand together and seek the truth. In the months after Colin Ashsmith's conviction, the fabric of daily life in the Dartford and Greenhithe areas began to settle into a steadier rhythm, yet something in the collective atmosphere had undeniably shifted. It was as though a fog that had clung to the community's conscience for more than 2 decades had finally lifted, revealing a landscape that had been quietly reshaped by the weight of the past. People noticed small things: how the air felt different when passing the old British Legion Club, how the walk along London Road seemed less haunted now, how the quiet corners of town no longer invited the same intrusive fear that once gripped them. For many residents, especially those old enough to remember the early 1990s, the closure of Clare Tiltman's case was not simply an end, it was a beginning. A beginning of conversations long avoided, of emotions long suppressed, of memories long tucked into the far corners of the mind. Some found themselves revisiting moments from the past, replaying days that had seemed ordinary at the time but now felt heavy with the knowledge of what had happened. The British Legion Club, once a hub of social life for the Tiltmans and many local families, became a place where remembrance intertwined with routine. People who had sung Clare happy birthday just days before her murder returned after the trial with renewed purpose. They shared quiet conversations at the bar, reminisced about the lively atmosphere of early 90s gatherings, and reflected on how Clare had always seemed to glow in those crowded rooms, as though she carried joy with her like a lantern. Some evenings, someone would order a drink and leave it untouched at the corner of the bar, a small, symbolic gesture to acknowledge Clare's absence and her enduring presence. Even younger patrons, who had been born years after the murder, came to recognize the significance of the place. They heard the older members speak about Clare, about Cliff and Linda, about the community's shock in 1993, and about the long shadow cast by the unknown killer. They learned the story not as distant history, but as part of the living memory of their town. In this way, Clare became more than a victim. She became a thread woven through the identity of an entire generation. In stone, the parish council incorporated Clare's legacy into community events. At seasonal fairs, small booths displayed photographs of local heroes, volunteers, and historical figures, and Clare's picture often appeared among them, not because she had achieved fame, but because she symbolized the heart of the community: youth, hope, aspiration, and the fragile nature of life. Children in the area sometimes asked their parents about the girl on the posters and plaques. The parents, depending on their levels of comfort and the ages of their children, offered gentle explanations. Some spoke about courage, others about compassion, a few about tragedy. All of them emphasized the importance of remembering. In those conversations, Clare's story became a quiet lesson in empathy, resilience, and the profound value of community vigilance. The community center, named in Clare's honor, continued to grow into a vibrant space that reflected the spirit she embodied during her life. Programs expanded, drawing in participants from neighboring towns. Young people attended workshops on community safety, emergency preparedness, and volunteer service topics that resonated deeply in a place marked by Clare's legacy. The staff often commented that the center felt like a living tribute, filled with energy, laughter, and the potential that Clare herself had carried so openly. In the far reaches of town, near the quiet lanes and old railway paths, survivors of past crimes found themselves confronting old fears that had lain dormant for years. Charlotte Barnard, the woman who survived the 1995 attack, had long lived with the emotional and physical scars of that night. For nearly 20 years, she had carried the knowledge that her attacker was out there, unpunished for Clare's murder. She had endured sleepless nights, intrusive flashbacks, and moments of sudden panic triggered by the sound of footsteps or the glint of metal. She lived with the weight of survival, a blessing, but also a burden. After Colin's conviction, Charlotte spoke publicly for the first time in years. She did not dwell on the violence she endured. Instead, she focused on gratitude that justice had been served, gratitude that Clare's family and friends finally had answers, gratitude that the nightmare she had survived had not ended in impunity. She said that while healing was an ongoing journey, the verdict had allowed her to breathe more freely than she had in decades. "It doesn't erase the past," she said quietly, "but it helps the future feel less heavy." Her words resonated deeply with the community. They served as a reminder that crimes leave ripples, touching the lives of people far beyond the victim alone. They also underscored the importance of perseverance in the pursuit of justice. Perseverance embodied by detectives, witnesses, friends, and survivors. The 1988 quarry victim, who had moved away from the region years earlier, wrote a letter to Kent police expressing her gratitude upon learning of the conviction. Though she chose to remain unnamed, her message carried enormous emotional weight. She described how the trial had reopened old wounds, yet also brought a measure of peace she once believed she would never feel. For years, she had carried the memory of the cold, silent quarry, the suffocating fear, the struggle to survive. She said she often wondered whether anyone would ever be held accountable for what had happened to her. Now, she felt a small but meaningful closure. Investigators who had worked on all three linked cases reflected on the enormous arc of time they had spent piecing together the puzzle of Colin Ash Smith's crimes. Some had retired long before the trial. Others had been young officers in the early years of Clare's case and now found themselves in supervisory roles. A few had dedicated decades of their careers to ensuring that Clare's name never left the unsolved case files. They remembered every interview, every taped statement, every door they knocked on. They remembered revisiting the Tiltman house over the years, sitting with Cliff and Linda as they shared their fears, their hopes, and their grief. One detective who had been part of the cold case review described the investigation as a marathon run across generations, not continuous, but relentless. He said the case had lived in the back of his mind for years, like a book he could never put down. He kept a photograph of Clare pinned above his desk, not as a symbol of the tragedy, but as a reminder of why they kept pushing forward. Every time frustration set in, he said, I'd look at that photo, and I'd think of Cliff and Linda, and I'd keep going. When the verdict came, he said he went home and sat in silence for almost an hour, just letting the weight of it sink in. It was victory mixed with sorrow, justice mixed with regret. He knew that justice had arrived too late for Clare's parents. But he also knew that the case had finally been given the ending it deserved. Even among the prosecution team, the conviction carried emotional depth. They spoke of the painstaking preparation required to weave decades of evidence, witness accounts, diary entries, and psychological analysis into a cohesive narrative the jury could understand. They emphasized how careful they had to be with every detail, how the lack of forensic evidence meant the case had to rely on behavioral patterns, circumstantial foundations, and the chilling consistency of Colin's violence. As one prosecutor put it wasn't a case built on fingerprints or DNA. It was a case built on truth. In the aftermath, journalists who had covered the trial wrote articles examining the significance of the Criminal Justice Act of 2003, the legislation that allowed prosecutors to present Colin's past attacks and diaries as evidence. They noted how crucial that law had been, not only in securing a conviction, but in reshaping the legal landscape for future cases. They interviewed legal experts who debated the ethical and procedural implications of admitting bad character evidence. They discussed how the Tiltman case might influence future trials across the country. Some articles focused on the societal implications of the long-delayed justice. They questioned why certain cases fade into obscurity, while others linger in the public consciousness. They examined the role of community memory, the impact of media coverage, and the psychological effect of unsolved crimes on collective well-being. They highlighted the extraordinary determination of the people who had refused to let Clare's story fade, from her closest friends to the wider community, who attended vigils, signed petitions, and supported police appeals. Meanwhile, true crime creators, including writers, documentary producers, and online channels began to explore Clare's case through different lenses. Some focused on the investigative timeline, examining how procedural diligence had eventually paid off. Others explored the psychology of Colin Ash Smith, analyzing how his diaries provided a rare, disturbing insight into the mind of a developing predator. A few delved into the cultural context of early 90s Britain, discussing how systems of accountability and community awareness differed from today's standards. Among these retellings, the Criminal Schema emerged as one of the voices committed to honoring the truth with respect and clarity. The tone of these narratives mattered, not sensationalized, not exploitative, but grounded in empathy for the victims and admiration for the perseverance that brought the case to its conclusion. Beyond the world of storytelling, the legacy of the case took root in deeper societal ways. Discussions about public safety evolved into more nuanced conversations about community responsibility, mental health, law enforcement resources, and the early warning signs of violent behavior. Clare's story became part of policing seminars, university courses, and community workshops. It served as a case study that illustrated both the challenges and the possibilities inherent in long-term investigations. In Greenhithe, a quiet but profound cultural shift unfolded. People became more attentive to each other. Neighborhood watches strengthened. Parents spoke openly with their children about boundaries, trust, and the importance of reporting concerning behavior. Local authorities improved lighting in certain areas, updated security measures around pedestrian paths, and partnered with community groups to promote safety initiatives. Clare's case was not the sole catalyst for these changes, but it remained a significant, guiding influence. As the 20th anniversary of Clare's death passed, followed by the 21st, the 22nd, and onward, the vigils became moments of unity rather than fear. At each gathering, candles flickered in the cold January air, illuminating the faces of people who refused to let Clare's memory fade. Her friends stood together, sometimes quietly holding hands, sometimes sharing small memories aloud. They spoke of the years that had passed, the lives they had built, the dreams they had pursued, the things Clare had never been given the chance to experience. One friend shared that she had recently become a mother, and during the birth of her daughter, she found herself thinking about Clare's mother, Linda, about the joy she must have felt holding Clare for the first time, and the unimaginable pain she had endured at the end. Another friend said that whenever she passed a fire station, she thought of Clare's dream of becoming a firefighter. It still hurt, she admitted, to think of what Clare would have done. But it also helped her remember who Clare had been: brave, passionate, determined. At one vigil, a man who had never known Clare stepped forward to speak. He said he had moved to the area only a few years earlier, but Clare's story had touched him deeply. He said he felt honored to attend the vigil, honored to stand with the community in remembrance. His presence symbolized how far Clare's story had reached, not just geographically, but emotionally. And through all these memorials, one sentiment echoed clearly: Clare had been loved, and she was still loved. Her story was no longer defined by the violence that ended her life, but by the compassion, resilience, and unity she inspired in the people who refused to forget her. In homes across Greenhithe, people still kept small reminders of Clare. A program from her funeral, tucked inside a drawer, a photograph pinned to a bulletin board, a newspaper clipping describing the conviction. These items were not held in morbid fascination, but as tokens of remembrance, symbols of a life that mattered deeply. For those who had known Clare personally, the passage of time brought both comfort and sorrow. They found themselves imagining who Clare might have become at 25, 30, 35. They pictured her celebrating holidays, building a family, traveling, achieving her dreams. They pictured her living the ordinary days too, the mornings with coffee, the evenings with friends, the laughter, the frustrations, the triumphs. They pictured her growing older, and though these imagined futures carried a bittersweet ache, they also honored the fullness of the person Clare had been. Through all of this, a question lingered in the quiet spaces of people's minds, not a question of guilt or innocence, not a question of evidence or verdicts, but something more emotional, more human. What does justice really mean when delivered so late? For some, justice meant closure. For others, it meant recognition. For others still, it meant the lifting of a burden carried for too long. But for almost everyone touched by the case, justice also meant remembrance. It meant ensuring that Clare's name remained part of the community's fabric. It meant telling her story with honesty and care. It meant refusing to let her life be overshadowed solely by the cruelty of her death. And so, the story of Clare Tiltman entered a new chapter, not defined by cold files or courtroom proceedings, but by the enduring human memory that outlasts fear, time, and tragedy. A memory shaped by love, community, and the unwavering belief that no matter how long it takes, the truth must be pursued. As the years continued to move forward, the legacy of Clare Tiltman's case settled into a deeper, more reflective chapter 1, shaped not by headlines or court hearings, but by the ordinary rhythms of life in Greenhithe, Stone, and the wider Kent area. Time did what time always does. It softened edges, it shifted perspectives, it wrapped the past in layers of context. And yet, despite the natural distance that formed between the present and the night Clare was murdered along London Road, her story remained present in a way that defied fading. It lingered in conversations, in memorials, in the way people looked out for one another, in the small rituals of remembrance that wove themselves into daily life. There was something profound in the way a community carried her memory. People spoke of it quietly, gently, as though Clare herself deserved a softness that contrasted against the violence that had taken her life. Parents would mention her name in discussions about safety, teachers invoked her story when speaking about courage and community responsibility, and older residents told newcomers about the tragedy not for shock value, but to explain how deeply it had shaped the town's identity. For Clare's school friends, now well into adulthood, her memory became something woven into their identities, much like childhood friendships often do, but with an added layer of solemn significance. They grew older, they married, they had children, they built careers. And yet, no matter how many years passed, Clare's presence stayed with them as a symbol of a chapter in their lives that ended far too abruptly. Some kept old-school photographs tucked inside the backs of albums. Others preserved letters she had written, filled with youthful handwriting and big dreams. Those pieces of Clare became small treasures, held as reminders of the girl she had been before tragedy struck. One friend described how, every year on Clare's birthday, she lit a single candle and placed it on her kitchen windowsill. It was a simple ritual, private and quiet, but it mattered. Another friend said she often spoke to her own children about Clare, not in grim detail, but as someone she had admired, kind-hearted, determined, spirited. She wanted her children to grow up understanding the value of empathy and the power of community, lessons that the pursuit of justice for Clare had reinforced again and again. Among Clare's extended family, the legacy she left behind took the form of stories shared at gatherings, stories that painted her in warm, vivid detail. They spoke about her childhood adventures, her love of dancing, her bond with her parents, her dedication to volunteering at the fire station. They kept her memory alive not through the lens of tragedy, but through recollections of laughter, hope, and everyday moments of joy. They made sure younger relatives who had never met Clare still knew who she was, not as a victim, but as someone deeply loved. Meanwhile, the Tiltman Center grew into one of the most active community spaces in Stone. With every workshop, class, community meeting, and youth event held within its walls, Clare's name gained a sense of life rather than loss. The center became a place where futures were shaped, where young people found encouragement, guidance, and opportunity. Staff members spoke often of wanting to honor Clare's spirit by helping the next generation flourish. They believed the center's vibrancy was a fitting tribute to a young woman who had carried so much potential. Throughout Kent, police forces also continued to reference Clare's case during training and seminars. It became a teaching tool not just for investigating cold cases, but for understanding offender patterns, community cooperation, and the significance of behavioral evidence when forensic clues are scarce. Officers who had been young recruits during the early years of the investigation sometimes stood before new classes and recounted the specifics of the case, the early days of confusion, the long periods of stalled progress, the breakthrough moments that rekindled hope, and the final push toward justice more than 2 decades later. One detective, now retired, described Clare's case as a silent companion that had followed him through his career. He said the conviction of Colin Ash Smith was one of the moments he felt most proud of, not because of personal achievement, but because of what it meant for Clare and her family. He said he kept a copy of the case's final briefing in a drawer at home as a reminder that some investigations demand patience beyond measure, that justice sometimes requires years of persistence and unwavering dedication. And though Colin Ash Smith remained incarcerated, his presence in the story began to fade, overshadowed by the collective desire to center Clare rather than her killer. People no longer referenced him with the fear or uncertainty that once colored conversations in Greenhithe. Instead, they spoke of him as someone removed from the community's life, a figure whose capacity to harm had been permanently stripped away. There was a sense of closure in that disconnection. The shadow he had cast over the town had receded, allowing something brighter to take its place. In the wider true crime community, Clare's case continued to resonate. Content creators who valued ethical storytelling emphasized the importance of respecting the victim, acknowledging the emotional weight of long-term investigations, and highlighting the painstaking work of law enforcement. They presented Clare's story not as a spectacle, but as a testament to perseverance. As the Criminal Schema, your channel's voice plays a vital part in framing her story through a lens of truth, honor, and clarity, something her friends would no doubt appreciate. True crime enthusiasts across different platforms remarked on the dignified way Clare's friends and community had pursued justice, comparing it to other cases where families fought tirelessly for answers. Clare's case, they said, illustrated how people can create meaningful change, even in the face of years of frustration. It showed that justice delayed is not always justice denied. As Clare's story reached new audiences through documentaries, podcasts, and written features, many people found themselves moved by the strength demonstrated by those who had known and loved her. Readers and viewers often commented on feeling unexpectedly emotional, not only because of the tragedy but because of the overwhelming love that surrounded Clare's memory. They said her story stayed with them long after they had learned the details, that they found themselves thinking about her as if she were someone they had known. In Greenhithe, new housing developments rose, roads were repaved, and local businesses changed hands. Yet the small memorial bench dedicated to Clare remained a quiet constant. People sat there throughout the seasons, sometimes reading, sometimes thinking, sometimes simply resting without realizing whose memory it honored. Others approached with intention, leaving a flower or running a gentle hand along the engraved plaque. The bench became a place where the community could pause, reflect, and honor a life lost too soon. The roses planted in Clare's name bloomed year after year, their petals opening in soft shades of pink and white. They stood as living symbols of resilience, beauty, and renewal. Residents often said the roses felt like Clare's presence woven into the landscape, a gentle reminder that even in the wake of darkness, life continues to grow. On anniversaries of Clare's death, quiet processions formed along the route she had taken on that January evening in 1993. Some people held candles, others walked in silence. A few carried small photographs of Clare, their edges worn soft with time. These vigils, once marked by fear and uncertainty, had transformed into acts of unity. They were no longer haunted by the unknown. They were filled with remembrance, with celebration, with the bittersweet recognition that Clare's life, though tragically short, had touched countless others in ways she never could have imagined. In these gatherings, people who had never met Clare felt drawn into the circle of remembrance, standing beside those who had known her best. They listened as friends shared stories, some funny, some tender, some painful. They learned who Clare was through the voices of those who loved her. And in hearing these accounts, Clare's memory transcended time, becoming part of the collective heart of the community. One evening, at a vigil held under the soft glow of street lamps, a woman stepped forward to speak. She had been a young teenager when Clare was murdered, and though she had not known Clare personally, she remembered the fear that spread through the town. She remembered newspapers with Clare's picture, police appeals broadcast on television, teachers warning students not to walk alone. She said she grew up thinking of Clare as a symbol of vulnerability, but now, with the case finally resolved, she saw Clare as a symbol of strength. She thanked Clare's friends and the police for never giving up, and said she hoped that future generations would honor Clare not with fear, but with admiration. Her words captured something essential: that the meaning of Clare's story had evolved. It was no longer a story solely defined by violence or loss. It had become a story about unity, courage, and the enduring power of remembrance. As decades passed, the world continued to change, but Clare's story remained woven into the fabric of the community, passed down through families, taught in schools, referenced in safety programs, honored at community events. People remembered not just the tragedy, but the girl behind it, the 16-year-old with big dreams, a bright laugh, and a life full of promise. Her name appeared on street signs, in community halls, in roses that bloomed each spring. Her story appeared in documentaries, articles, and thousands of conversations shared across kitchen tables, workplaces, classrooms, and online forums. She lived on through memories, through impact, through legacy. In the end, what struck many people most deeply was that Clare Tiltman's case demonstrated a truth more profound than any court verdict: that justice is not a moment, but a journey. A journey that spans years, hearts, and generations. A journey shaped by those who refuse to let a story end unfinished. And for Clare, that journey brought her community full circle, from fear and uncertainty, through perseverance and pain, to resolution and remembrance. Her name became a symbol of why we pursue truth, why we honor victims, why we support one another through the darkest of times. Even all these years later, when a passerby reads the sign, Tiltman Avenue, or pauses at the memorial bench, or walks into the Clare Tiltman Center, her presence is felt quietly, gently, but unmistakably. She is there in the way people speak her name. She is there in the flowers placed each January. She is there in the smiles and laughter of young people who benefit from the community spaces that bear her legacy. She is there in the hearts of those who loved her and those who learned her story long after her passing. Clare Tiltman's life, though short, continues to echo through remembrance, through justice, through the love of a community that refused to forget her. And in that echo, she remains more than a victim of a crime. She remains a symbol of hope, resilience, and the unwavering belief that truth, no matter how long it takes, must always be pursued. And as the Criminal Schema, we honor Clare by telling her story with respect, clarity, and the knowledge that every retelling ensures her legacy grows stronger. Her memory endures, her light continues, and her story, filled with heartbreak, perseverance, and ultimate justice, stands as a lasting testament to the power of community. If you appreciated this documentary-style narrative, please remember to like the video, leave a respectful comment, and hit the subscribe button to support the Criminal Schema. Your engagement helps bring important stories to light, honors victims like Clare, and keeps the truth alive.